What's happening, Gonzaga fans? Christian Pedersen, joined by Dan Dickau. We welcome you back to another episode of the Gonzaga Nation podcast. I'm not sure if we're doing this one Irish wake style or just doing an autopsy or whatever we're saying, but Gonzaga, a great tournament run. We're going to ignore the fact that they didn't win a national championship. We're still going to call this season a tremendous success because based off of any other metric that any other program would use in the nation, this was a successful year. So I think that qualifies as another success for Gonzaga. If you look back at some of the first podcasts that we were doing this season, there was a lot of unknowns. Now all of those ended up being known, great, fantastic quantities. A lot of tremendous athletes. Coach Few did another great coaching job. Dan did another great broadcasting job. It all ended up being a fantastic year. So Dan, let's look back. Do you want to, start tournament, jump back to the season, do forward, like however you want to navigate us through, but let's tie a bow on this season. Let's talk a little bit about your thoughts and your takeaways, and then we'll close out with some looking ahead.
Yeah, I mean, all in all, another fantastic season. If you're not happy with 27-8 and the Sweet 16, your expectations are out of whack. I mean, look at what happened and has happened in Kentucky in the last couple of weeks. They're, talked about by many people as a potential Final Four candidate. They lose early in that first round to Oakland, and now all of a sudden John Calipari just decides, I don't want to deal with this anymore, and he's moving to Arkansas. I mean, he's literally putting the bow on a new contract in Arkansas, so that's going to throw the coaching carousel in another upheaval, which is always a fun thing, to keep an eye on. Although I don't think it's anything that's ever outside of the year Tommy Lloyd left Gonzaga. It's never really impacted Gonzaga too much. Now, here's an interesting one. What if, and I don't think it's going to happen, but what if Kentucky comes knocking on Coach Mark Few's door? There's a very, very real possibility that they at least make a phone call. If you're the Kentucky AD and you're sitting there looking at the landscape of college basketball, right? You have to at least give a phone call to Mark Few. I mean, he's the winningest percentage coach in college basketball history. His teams have now been to 9 straight Sweet 16s. He's been in more Final Fours over the last 12 years than John Calipari has. Yes, Calipari has the one national title at Kentucky, but that was early in his tenure. Kentucky's flamed out in the first round in recent years on more than one occasion. And it's kind of one of those things where how Calipari structured his philosophy of building a program was built for 10 years ago when you could get the one and dones, the 5 stars. Now you have to be very, philosophical on how you build your roster. Get some program guys, some foundational pieces, get some stars here and there. Even though as freshmen, we've learned that very rarely do freshmen have huge impacts on teams that make deep NCAA tournament runs. The only freshman that's playing meaningful minutes in the Final Four is Stephen Castle at UConn. Well, guess what? He kind of slowly built into a bigger role as the course of the season went on. He's a McDonald's All-American, but he's the only McDonald's All-American of any Final Four team that starts. I believe he might be the only Final Four team total. So, the way you build rosters is different. Coach Few has shown foundational program guys that grow over the course of their career, sprinkle in some Euros, get guys to believe, and then be very selective in the portal. Now, I think you have to be active in the portal in this day and age of college basketball, but it's how you go about being selective in the portal, getting the right guys that fit, as opposed to just get the right guys due to the rankings or whatever their reputation may be. Because that's the other thing is if you look at Purdue and UConn playing in that national title, they've got transfers, but they don't have an abundance of transfers. You're talking about programs that are kind of built in the way that I just kind of talked about. So that'll be interesting. I would imagine a phone call is made. I don't think there would be mutual interest, but crazier things have happened. But I just had to put that out there as that Calipari Arkansas deal is getting finished.
Well, so well, man, that was one that I had not even closely considered. My overreactionary, limited scope of college basketball brain went straight to what a perfect closing of the book for Rick Pitino to come full circle from disgrace back to Kentucky and running that. But what would even be? I know you say Calipari or you say Mark Few will be called, but what would even be the allure of Kentucky? It's not like, I mean, do they just have, because they have football, they have more resource? Like, do they even have anything better than Gonzaga right now? Or are we in a position where Gonzaga just all around is a better option than Kentucky, which sounds great?
It's Kentucky. I mean,
So it's
when you look
just
at,
blue blood mysticism.
yeah, I mean, if
Duke,
you look at,
UNC, Kentucky,
and Gonzaga is considered a blue blood in college basketball nowadays, right? I would put them with, you know, um, Kansas, Duke, those kind of names, Villanova, UConn. But in regards to historical blue bloods, to me, I mean it's UCLA, it's Kentucky, it's Duke, Carolina. Those are the historical blue bloods, the ones that are kind of like, hey, they've been tremendous over years. Yeah, they've had some ups and downs. What program hasn't? They had sanctions with Eddie Sutton and all that. But what college basketball coach, if Kentucky calls you, do you just say, I have no interest? You at least got to hear the pitch. And that's all I'm saying. Now, do I think Coach Few would take it? Probably not. Years ago, maybe so. But I think he's shown and proven that he can do so much at Gonzaga, get them on the doorstep of two national titles, that what he wants to accomplish by winning a national title can be done at Gonzaga. Now, the counter to that, you mentioned unlimited resources. It's a football school. Well, guess what? Kentucky is in the SEC. There's a lot more money. I'm sure there's a lot more, without knowing the logistics and the NIL budgeting of both schools. I can only imagine it's a large number times X what the NIL budget is in Kentucky. And now the pressures are a lot higher, but if you are creative in building a roster, if you're good at building a roster in the ways that I described earlier, and you have that budget that would be given to you through a collective at Kentucky, you could do some pretty impressive things. Now, I'm not saying Coach Calipari didn't do it right. Obviously, he wanted to move on, and others. I'm not around that program in day out, so I can't say it with too much clarity. But could you imagine Coach Few with the resources of a Kentucky, in his discerning eye in recruiting and evaluating, putting together game plans? He's shown that he can do it at Gonzaga. Think about what it would be like at Kentucky. Now, for Gonzaga fans that are listening to this, thinking I might be blaspheming, I'm not saying he's doing it. I'm just saying the reasons why it would make sense for the Kentucky AD to make a phone call and for there at least to be, one phone call on both sides explaining opportunities, asking questions, diving in just to scratch the surface and see if it would make sense.
It kind of seems like, I know this is a shift in sports, but at the end of the movie Moneyball, Brad Pitt takes a meeting with the Red Sox where the Red Sox GM or the Red Sox owner says to him about, why are you even here to interview? I talked with the A's owner. He already said you're going to re-up your contract. And Brad Pitt kind of like throws his hands up because it's the Red Sox, man. Why would I not take the interview?
Yes.
So I get that, but at the same time, it is amazing to hear you have to kind of churn for 5 minutes to come up with how Mark Few would want Kentucky over Gonzaga, and not just have it be, well, it's Kentucky. Of course he's going to go. That's an awesome statement on the status of what Gonzaga has been built into, that without the football, without the overall resources, without the conference and everything like that, Mark Few's going to have to be presented with a Brinks truck in backing up to his front door in order to want to go on in that. Anything else in the coaching, or can we talk a little bit about the players?
Well, I mean, just in regards to coaching, I mean, obviously we cover the WCC throughout as well. I mean, a couple coaching movements in the WCC. Pacific has hired their coach, and then we see that Pepperdine replaced Lorenzo Romar with Ed Schilling, who was at Grand Canyon. And then Lorenzo Romar didn't take long for him to find a home. He's now with Stan Johnson at LMU. So nothing that's a huge mover and shaker, but at least those two jobs in the league are filled. So there's no active schools looking in the league right now. The one that's curious here locally, Washington State with Kyle Smith moved on to Stanford. David Riley at Eastern moved over to Washington State down the road. But you never know with Eastern being right down the street. Is there a phone call to a Gonzaga assistant or two just to gauge interest? I don't think that would be the case. But again, I think it's just one of those things that has to be mentioned. I mean, it's something that I think any AD that is kind of, in a search kind of has to, cast a wide net, look at a lot of different opportunities and see where maybe you find the best fit. But I don't think any Gonzaga assistants would be leaving to become the head man at Eastern.
I somewhat laughed there just because I thought you were going to say that Mark Few was going to also get a call from Eastern Washington. And I was going to be like, that's a weird set of phone calls if Kentucky calls with an offer on one line and Eastern Washington's calling on another line. Okay, so players wise, when we talked kind of going into the tournament, you already gave your postseason player, rookie, all that of the year. But just is there any updates just in terms of what you saw Gonzaga wise, or you can talk whole WCC wise, but this is a Gonzaga specific question that you saw in the tournament that you just want to update the people on in terms of X, Y, or Z really performed well under the bright lights that gave you hope or gave you despair or anything like that? Just any other player updates and analysis before we head into the offseason stuff.
Well, I think the big thing is, when you look at Gonzaga's roster in totality, they had some really good pieces. It took them a little bit of time, as we've talked about throughout the season, to understand roles, gel within those roles, really kind of figure out how this team needed to play to be successful. But once they did, they were one of the best teams in the country, to be honest. I mean, 9 straight Sweet 16s, something that no other team can claim right now. 16 straight win seasons, I believe it is, with 25 wins or more, which no other team can claim. So, another successful season. But if you're talking about just
Yeah, I
individual,
think my question was through the 4 tournament games, was there anybody that you're like, oh, hey, X, Y, or Z? That was kind of pleasant. That was nice to watch.
well, I mean, I think a lot of guys had bright spots throughout the tournament. Nolan Hickman had a couple bright spots. Ryan Nemhart had some good stretches, although Braden Smith did. I don't want to say Braden Smith outplayed him. I mean, but he had 15 assists in that game against Purdue. Uh, I think Anton showed why he was such a valuable member of this program for the last 5 years and kind of continued to endear himself as a Gonzaga legend. EK had great stretches. Ben Gregg had some terrific moments as well. I think overall, when you look at it, in the world of college basketball and the transfer portal, and I know we're going to probably have some of these conversations over the next couple of weeks as the portal continues to expand and players find new homes. You're always going to have to keep your eye out on player movement. Players have the flexibility and the options to move. That's just the name of the game now. But when I look at each particular player's opportunities at Gonzaga as well as in other places, now maybe I'm being an optimist. I don't see a lot of player movement out of the program this year.
I love Dan being an optimist.
Because
Fantastic.
yeah, I mean, you look at what's here, what they just added in Michael Ajayi, what they could return in Steel Venters coming off his injury. This could be another team that's primed for a preseason top 10 ranking and make a big run. Now, guys, I'm sure are going to test the NBA waters. Michael Ajayi already did put his name in the NBA draft selection committee. But, it's one of those things where and again, being an optimist, if all things hold true and the majority of this roster comes back and they add a piece or two, they're going to be pretty darn good again. And they're going to be a fun basketball team to watch.
Well, Dan, let's talk about then the offseason. You talk about that piece or two. You talk about the coach few coaching situation. You have alluded to some of what needs to happen over the offseason. You've also alluded to we somewhat flog a dead horse with transfer portal discussions and all that. So I'm not asking you to necessarily lay out the entire roadmap of what the offseason looks like but if you could give the people just kind of like the cliff notes of, hey, here are the major milestones to look for coming up in the off season? Just what's a little taste for that? I mean, do people need to look for who's the first domino to fall player wise, transfers in or out? Is there more of let's focus on recruiting? What is just a couple of things that you think the Gonzaga fans need to be paying attention to in the next month or so?
Well, I think, the fact that the NBA early entrant deadline entry deadline just opened up. So you're going to see guys all across the country put their name in the NBA draft process. The one thing I do like the NBA has changed is you can put your name in the draft, go through some workouts, and that doesn't affect your eligibility. So you can kind of test the waters. Steel Ventures did that last year. Anton did that last year. Drew Timmy did that the year before. So, I would imagine Ryan Nemhart does that. I would imagine Graham Ike does that. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if Nolan Hickman and Ben Gregg do that just to get that experience. Because all these guys want to play at the next level. Whether or not they're going to be good enough when the time comes, that's not for me to make that determination or that prediction right now. But all these guys want to play at that next level. So if you want to, why not put yourself in a setting where you can experience what it would be like and get real-time feedback from the people, front office executives, etc., that are making those decisions.
And to do it
Now,
responsibly
I
without
think
losing your possible spot on your team and having to nuke your eligibility and all that is a great setup by the NCAA. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. Now, what it does is it creates a lot of headache for college coaches to continue to manage a roster in flux between guys that are in the draft, guys that are in the portal, because many guys will be in the portal and in the draft and saying they're keeping their option to come back to their current school all in one. So it's one of those things where coaches have to be extremely flexible. They have to try to be as open and honest with players as possible, which in this day and age is hard considering there's so much money that's being presented or promised in NIL. And I guarantee you this, a lot of the NIL deals are true, but more than you would think are not true with what the true
Smoke and
number
mirrors.
is.
Yeah, smoke and mirrors.
Because, yeah, because I mean, agents are going to drive their players' value up or where their perceived value up to get that money. Because again, the college, one of the things, and I know we're going off on a little tangent, we don't have too much more time, but one of the things about, college players getting paid now and having the ability to be represented by agents, professionals, your player agent, they're contractually in a standard player agent contract. They get 4% of the negotiated services. On the marketing side, they get anywhere from 10 to 20, depending on the arrangement and depending on how the deal was brought to the table. As a college player, these agents just get straight 20% off the top, is what I've heard, because they're marketing deals. They're not player agent deals. So you're seeing a lot of agents that are really kind of finagling their way into the world of college basketball, and really, seeing, and I'm sure thinking to myself, well, look, if there's a $10,000 deal and I got to put X amount of hours into getting 20% of that, I'm not doing that. I'm going to escalate this up to where it's a 60, 70,000 deal, because the 20% of that for an agent is well worth their time and effort reviewing contracts, rewriting contracts, negotiating it. So I think the agents have had a huge part in driving this NIL space into something that a lot of people don't recognize. And it's constantly changing. I mean, look, I'm in this world of college basketball, following games left and right, talking to coaches, talking to other broadcasters, doing prep throughout the year. And I can't keep all these deals straight.
Yeah, I would also throw out there that I have read and heard some rumblings that 247 and a couple of the other player analysis and ranking just company entities at the high school side are going to start getting into NIL representation as well, which feels like it's going to even further muddle this, that there's some of these larger companies responsible for giving said player a 4 or 5 star evaluation that are then
100%. You
also
just beat me to that comment, because if that's true and you've got these player rankings that generate a lot of clout, for schools wanting players. Oh, a lot of schools do their initial recruiting list based on these ranking services. They don't even know a kid from left or right, but they see, hey, he's a 4-star, it's 6'7", 6'8", whatever it is. We have a need at that position. They'll start recruiting a guy without even knowing. But if agents and or people have, a hand in it, they're going to try to jack their rankings up for certain guys that they represent. So it is a weird, muddied world out there that not everything is as it seems, and so you got to kind of go in really careful to all these observations in my eyes.
Yeah. I celebrate just knowing that I beat Dan to a scoop is always nice, but also it's a terrible scoop to be beating somebody too. That college basketball is headed into an even muddier, more confusing world where, some Santa Clara or somebody at that, like not quite up there, but on the precipice trying to get a 4 or 5 star is going to get fleeced by someone who's really a 2-star masquerading as a 4-star because they had a good connection with a guy that wanted to pump their value and yada yada. It makes it even more. It feels like it puts more pressure on the coaches to really go that extra mile in terms of vetting and recruiting. And sometimes
Oh,
there's
it's going to separate a lot of coaches.
well, sometimes it
The
also
ones
makes
who
maybe
can
just want to walk
coach.
away from the high school recruiting and just focus on the portal because
Yeah.
why risk a somewhat unproven commodity if you can just be like, okay, that guy has a year or two of college tape. Yes, he comes with a little bit higher price tag, but we know we've actually seen him against X, Y,
Yeah.
or Z type of college stuff.
Well, what you're going to see is you're going to see staffs with, and you're already seeing it, that have a dedicated staff member to just keeping an eye on the portal. You're going to have staffs that are still have a member that are just dedicated to director of recruiting, and a lot of times that's geared towards high school, but many times now it's also geared towards the portal. But you're going to find the coaches that can truly evaluate and recruit and build rosters um, through their eyes and what fits their program is going to be even more valuable than someone who has a blank check in the NIL world. Now, we saw that with Arkansas over last year. Eric Musselman had an enormous NIL collective budget from what all intents and purposes I've heard, seen, and read. But you got the wrong guys that just didn't fit. Now Eric Musselman's a tremendous coach. He's going to USC after leaving Arkansas, which opened up the door for Calipari. But it doesn't necessarily mean you got the most money, you got the most quote stars coming to your program that they fit in the right way.
I like the visual of a coach just dedicated with a pair of binoculars actually watching a physical just portal and just players come flying in and out. He's like, oh, crikey, there's one. Like, go grab, like, because that's basically what it seems like it's becoming is just this random grab that we will, like I said, get to a ton over the offseason. So we don't need to go entirely into that. Let me just ask maybe, is there any non-portal, non-transfer, just other stuff that you want to watch for in the offseason? Is there any other just kind of loose in Gonzaga? Hey, look to see if we schedule this game against this or any other just kind of minutia.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the last thing to really kind of keep an eye out is you know, when the schedule starts taking shape. Last year, if we remember, I mean, it came out a good month or so
Yeah,
later than it had in years past.
and I think I just use schedule as a fill in the blank, but I just
Yeah, I mean,
wanted
I
to avoid
think,
us going too far down the portal.
Gonzaga is always in a good, excuse me, MTE multi-team event, a tournament every year. So I don't know off the top of my head if it's the Atlantis or it's Orlando, but I know they're in a good one this upcoming year. Um, with Calipari at Kentucky moving on to Arkansas, it's hard to say if that Gonzaga Kentucky series will continue. I don't read those contracts, but I'm curious if there might be a contingency if one of the coaches leaves, if that contract in series is done, because many times that happens. So if not, Kentucky would be on the schedule. Gonzaga, I'm sure, is going to have one of the better non-conference schedules that's out there. To gear them up to knowing that, hey, you get in the WCC, you're going to have St. Mary's, and San Francisco's gotten better. But now this upcoming year, Oregon State, Washington State in the league now kind of change things up a little bit. Both programs are kind of, I don't want to say in turmoil, but up in the air in regards to what they're going to bring to the table next year. Because The two best players in the backcourt for Oregon State are in the transfer portal. And then in regards to Washington State, we touched on it earlier. Their head coach left. They've got a new coach. Most of their team is in the portal, trying to figure out what they're doing. It's hard to say at this moment in time what those two schools bring to the WCC. But that being said, it's, we touched on a lot of different offseason topics throughout this podcast. I think it just kind of scratches the surface on how many different angles we can take this show over the next 6-7 weeks before there's a lot of clarity. Because I don't think you're going to have a lot of clarity in college basketball until that final entry deadline of staying in the NBA draft or coming back to school is. And those are things that we'll be touching on in the next few weeks with the show.
Yeah, it becomes different forms of chaos. It becomes like complete chaos, then unmolded chaos, then somewhat molded chaos, then finite chaos. But no matter what, the off season is a ton of question marks and unknowns. I guess let's close out on saying thank you, everybody, for your support throughout another great season. It was so much fun to be able to deliver this content to you guys, the viewers that make this all possible. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you to our support staff. Reagan probably doesn't want me naming her, but Reagan is awesome. She is our fearless leader. Cole, you, Dan, Rob Sacre, everybody, Adam, all the coaches, everyone that came into studio, just a huge thank you for all the love and support you guys show to us. We really hope and appreciate the chance to continue to give it back to you in future years. I guess, Dan, let's just close out on this. If Kentucky comes calling, will you take the job?
Will I take the job? Yes, I'll get on the first thing smoking back to Lexington if I'm offered the job.
Okay, fair enough. So just know that if the podcast misses a Monday, maybe Dan is now the Kentucky head coach. You never know. That's how little we know about this college basketball offseason. Thank you guys, everyone, for another great season. We'll talk to you next week.